Dr. Mark Jangizi here with your Science Moment. Today, I'm going to talk a bit about the differences or similarities between the way that people are behaving towards Russia during this Russia and Ukraine crisis, and the way that they've been behaving for the last 2 years concerning COVID. Now, in both cases, there's this obvious mass hysteria that's been going on, and it's completely switched over from COVID is disproportionately dangerous and we should overturn society. And then within just the next day, it became that all Russians are unclean instead of just the unvaccinated. Now, I'm setting aside, who's at blame. It's very complicated, the Russia-Ukraine story, but nevertheless, we have this narrative which has completely turned Russia into the greatest evil ever, and we should have entered the war yesterday. And often amongst the same folks that were happening to be on the COVID cult side. But what I want to focus on today is that by seeing the kind of mass hysteria that's going on in terms of war, you can, which is incredibly irrational and dangerous, immensely dangerous. There's a sense in which there's at least some sort of notion of functionality to it. So, in the case of moral panic, and these are the evil, unclean enemy, which is now being focused on the Russians. Now, much of what one does, as we've talked about before, when you virtue signal, often these virtue signals really are completely useless and by design, or even slightly harmful or slightly anti-useful. Because if they were useful, then just everybody would go around signaling these things, and it wouldn't be a signal of membership in your club. So very often, showing flags on your, banners as little signals on your Instagram channel, and many different kinds of ways of signaling that you're part of doing something, or you might then say like we should cut their ability to, stop using Russian information or stop using Russian, vodka. You're actually pouring down vodka, refusing to have Moscow mules anymore, things like this. These things are actually hurting you slightly because you can't use your vodka anymore. And that way, not just, pro-Russian people would never do that, and people who don't give a crap would never do that. So it shows, if it turned out vodka was suddenly poisonous because of some cosmic rays, then we would all do it. There was a good reason. So the kinds of things that people do to signal their membership in a group that's against some other group are often things that are in fact slightly irrational, and it needs to be that, otherwise they wouldn't have culturally evolved to be the signals that work. Now, so what I want to point out is that as irrational as that is, in the case where your enemy is other people, in this case, supposedly Russia, let's say, well, actually, these kinds of moral panics and mass delusions and these kinds of irrational behaviors do have effect, because you can put fear in your enemy. You can destabilize them. You can shore up support on your own side by having strong membership signals. You can bring up more people into your side. You can identify enemies more easily. So there's all the kinds of things, and so the kind of treatment of the outgroup as unclean and gross and dirty, those things actually do something, even if they're totally, in some sense, aren't locally rational. They can affect what's going on in a conflict with a human enemy or a group of human enemies. So they turn out to be functional. They typically probably do way more harm than good, but they actually do something in terms of the enemy that you're fighting, which may not be an enemy at all, and you're all in a delusion. But nevertheless, it actually does something. So there's a sense in which it's even worse, this in a logical sense, in the case where your enemy is a pandemic, because here you're shoring up support and all of these kinds of things that can make my side strong against your side. And all of these things mass delusions do, and as we've talked about in cooties, treating the enemies as if they have cooties, which is what outgroups, what these mass delusions do and create these narratives. Well, if your enemy is a pandemic, if your enemy is viral aerosols, which are just floating around and out of, just floating through the spaces of the environment that you're in, well, none of these things are going to do anything, right? Your enemy in this case doesn't feel like it's in the out group, and thus feel like, well, I want to come into the in group. None of these kinds of moral panic, psychosocial forces that people might irrationally do that actually have effect in human conflicts have any effect when it's a pandemic and it's a viral aerosol. So I just wanted to point out this distinction. So it's not always the case that the reason that these kinds of narratives and these kinds of group thinks are selected for, that is, they can come to be selected for in certain circumstances by virtue of both emergent properties as well as things that you're selecting to make ourselves distinct and recognizable from them, those sorts of things. And those things can have effect. Those things can potentially sometimes be employed for good. And there are probably various times when they have been. But nevertheless, they can have actual effect on the enemies. I just want to point out that those things just have no effect on other certain kinds of things like viruses. And so it was just doubly irrational the last 2 years. All of this was all of the instincts that we have on having an enemy, which is usually a human enemy, almost always. Those are the people that killed us historically. It was other humans. All of that was targeted at a virus, and then eventually targeted at the unvaccinated, because it really wants to find a human target. And that was your science moment.